Good evening, everyone. So let me first welcome you to the first public plenary of SCCS 2017. So this evening we have Dr. Diogo Verissimo. The truth is he's on his way to Oxford from Portugal via Bangalore. So yeah, nice stopover. Thanks, Diogo, for coming. So, so his research primarily focuses on adapting marketing principles and theory for conservation. Diogo has a kind of a unique qualification in that he was here at SCCS 2013 as a presenter, as a student presenter, and he's now back to give us a plenary. So that's a big step, which is actually, yeah, pretty amazing. So before that, let me also say that Diogo and I did our PhDs together from same lab. Diogo has also won several prestigious awards, one of which is the Society for Conservation Biology Smith Fellowship. He's also the winner of the Early Conservationist Award from IUCN, presented in Hawaii, Early Career Award at the SEB that was held earlier this year. And of course, these are the awards that he holds, but I think what he's very, very famous for, if I can use the F word, is an online platform that he started called I Fucking Love Biodiversity. I don't know if any of you are already followers, but if you're not, please add to it. There are already 32,000 people on it, and I'm sure we can, add to that that line. More recently, Diogo has started a little web resource. It's called lostandfoundnature.com, something that he's going to talk about. And what's interesting about this is it's a compilation of stories about how species that were once lost were rediscovered. So it's not just the fact that they've been rediscovered, but the stories behind how they were rediscovered. So I think it's going to be really interesting. Before I go on and on, there's a lot to, but I'll just invite Diogo to give his talk. And his talk this evening is about bringing science into conservation outreach and why and how it's important. Thanks.
Right. So thank you very much, Abhishek, for the lovely introduction. Very good afternoon, everyone. Namaskara. I'm incredibly excited to be here today in this capacity of a plenary speaker after being in 2013, where the city was still called Bangalore, and now I have the chance to share a little bit of my work with all of you. So yeah, I stole a little bit of my thunder. This was my cover slide for my student presentation. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about conservation outreach, how that plays out with science. I'm going to use wildlife trade as an example of some of the things that we know and some of the things that we still haven't discovered. And I'm going to give you then a little bit of the bigger picture. So I'll start by saying conservation is about people. Sometimes it's easy to fall into this perception that it is actually about plants, about animals, but mostly it's about people. And you can easily see this if you think about the threats or the reasons why species go extinct. Those are all things that clearly have to do with humans. We are the agents of all of those threats. Our behavior, the choices we make every day, are the reason these species are disappearing. Now, of course, this is really not a particularly spectacular revelation, and we've known this for a long time, and we have dressed this up in many different names: environmental education, conservation education, more recently, more social marketing, conservation marketing, all these different types of fields and approaches that try to tackle human or influence, say, human behavior. Now, it's been about 40 to 50 years since we have started doing this in a more organized fashion. And so I think it's perhaps time that we look back and think, what have we learned from all this conservation outreach work? What is the evidence that we are going anywhere? And what can we do in the next decade to push the envelope a little bit as a field to do things a little bit better? So in a conservation science conference, I think a lot of you fall back to the scientific method when we're thinking of addressing a question like this. What works, what doesn't, those types of questions. We fall back to this type of type of thinking, this sort of mental model. And I think it's pretty great. And I think it's a pretty good thing, the scientific method. The thing that to me surprises me a little bit is that we often have this big divide between what is scientific in conservation science and then the outreach and this other sort of side of conservation that's more human targeted. It seems like when we start talking about humans instead of, say, tigers, a little bit of our affection, our devotion to the scientific method goes away, and we become almost inexplicably a lot more comfortable with uncertainty, with these big sort of gaps in our knowledge of how things work. So in other fields, like health, with a Cochrane collaboration, and say education, amongst other fields with the Campbell collaboration, there have been some platforms that have been dedicated to amassing evidence and understanding what works and what doesn't, through, for example, systematic reviews. Now, in conservation, we have some things that are trying to get at the same mission as these two platforms, but we really don't have anything that really matches them. And that's a little bit of a gap. And I'm happy to, if anyone has any questions at the end, we can discuss a little bit of what the details of this looks like. So today, I am going to be talking to you a little bit about some of the outreach work that goes on in one particular area of conservation science, and that is wildlife trade. Now, I chose that for two reasons. First, because it is a hot topic, so I was hoping that it would keep you interested. And the second one is because I have done a much broader review across a lot of environmental areas, and I find that this is actually really representative of what goes on in other sectors. Now, I said wildlife trade, and traditionally when we think about wildlife trade, we think about people. We most of the time think about the supply side. We think about enforcement, boots on the ground, drones, surveillance, those types of things. But that's only half of the issue. There's also the other side, which is the demand side. And of course, I'm sure that all of you are now familiar with different types of campaigns that have been conducted by conservation NGOs that try to target consumers in a lot of these consumer countries. Campaigns like this, for example.
If you're buying rhino horn, you may be paying for more than just horn. You're paying for guns, bullets, poison arrows, stencil, axes, and machetes to hack off the face of the rhino. And you are paying for the life of a beautiful creature. So please tell your friends and relatives, never buy products made from rhino horn. When the buying stops, the killing can too.
All right, so that's a pretty impressive visual. You usually remember that. A lot of these campaigns, of course, have a lot of very clever conceptual work behind them. But the reality is that we don't really know very much about them. And traditionally, in my experience, we hear a lot about them when they launched, but almost nothing about them after they completed. And that's no good, because obviously we want to know what works and what doesn't. How can we do better? How can we learn? So what I did was very much in the same tradition as the Cochrane collaboration, Campbell collaboration, try to think about a systematic review, thinking about learning as much as we can about those efforts. And so I started with the traditional thing, your organized databases, literature databases, your Web of Science, the Google Scholar, all those things. That didn't get me very far. And I say here, when I say I, is the collective I, because this work was done with several collaborators that I have to acknowledge. Then we moved on to the websites of organizations that worked in wildlife trade. Looked at their reports, look at any information they have about efforts to reduce demand. Right? That's what we're interested in. So that got us a little bit further. So we then moved on to funders, A lot of them have reports of the things they fund, so we're going through those. Repositories of great literature. Some of them are online. You can search them. That's another resource. And then, of course, we also ended up just asking a variety of experts for resources. Where could we find this information? Now, at the end, we ended up with this number, 236 different campaigns to reduce demand for a variety of different wildlife products. Now, I'm not going to stand here and say that this is the number of campaigns that have been implemented. That's clearly not true. But I'm reasonably confident that this is the number of campaigns, or roughly in the ballpark of the number of campaigns that have information accessible. And how big of a difference that is, I'm also happy to discuss that. And I'll come back to this issue in just a few minutes. So let me give you a little bit of a taste of what this work to reduce demand for products looks like so far. Now, if we slice it in temporal terms, we know that we've had more and more campaigns as time has gone by. So initially we had not so many, and now in in this current decade, in the first 6 years, which was when the data was collected for this bar here, we've had pretty much the same number as in the previous decade. So we have more effort, which is nice. Now, I want to draw your attention to this tiny gray bar here. Now, that gray bar, not very much, it's about 15% of the campaigns. And those are the campaigns that we couldn't find a date for. Now, that doesn't seem like a very important detail at first, but if you think that the year something was conducted, it's a pretty basic detail. And almost any summary of a campaign that you can think of would probably contain that information. Hints at the fact that it was really, really difficult to find this information. And there were lots of gaps. And it was really like a puzzle at times to put together all of these bits of information from different sources. And that made our work a lot harder. Now, let me walk you through this one bar chart. What this bar chart says is that there are two big areas where demand reduction work happens. One of them is around topic areas, and there's two big topic areas, seafood and bushmeat. Those are the two big colors here and there. If you can see this one up here. And that when it comes to focused species or campaigns that are focused on species, unsurprisingly, mammals take the lion's share, and of course, no surprises there also, it's your tigers, your bears, your elephants, and your rhinos that take the lion's share of all the effort. Now, more interestingly, this is something I didn't anticipate at the beginning, there've actually been quite a lot of campaigns on fish, and this is because of the work that's been done on sharks. So quite a lot of demand reduction work around sharks, and that's interesting. Less interesting, or equally interesting but less exciting, is to see how plants are doing right there. That's plants. One campaign we could find. Which is surprising, thinking that we have groups like orchids, for example, huge biological group with many species, many of which are threatened by wildlife trade in one capacity or another, and so very little demand reduction work done. Now, when it comes to where these campaigns have been done, not many surprises. A third, or a little bit more over a third, in Asia. A little bit of other effort spread around, and the other second area comes in as North America. And this is maybe a little bit surprising, maybe not so much, because of course a lot of the organizations that conduct these efforts are based in the United States. And a lot of these initiatives, although they are cataloged as demand reduction initiatives, have also a fundraising element. And so for these organizations, it is often worth to conduct these campaigns in the United States as well. Although, to be fair, the United States is an important consumer state for some wildlife products like ivory. All right, cool. So we know a little bit about these campaigns over in space, in time, so what? Well, then, what I'm really interested in is to understand a bit more about what have we learned? What is the evidence around them? And so, and I'm going to thank Amanda for doing all the input, output, outcome, impact work that's already done for me, and that's great. So one of the things I was interested in is understanding what information we have available when it comes to results, right? outcomes for this. Now, if you look at campaigns, and that's relative frequencies there, almost all of the campaigns, or say, let's say 70, let's say the majority of the campaigns, report inputs, right? So staff time, what funding was used, those types of things, time and money, basically. Now, if you think about outputs, and outputs will be the things like how many posters were printed, how many schools were visited, those types of things. Now, that comes down to about half of the campaigns. Now, and as Amanda mentioned, up until here, we're really not getting very excited, because those are the easy things to report, and they don't really mean anything. Now, the fact that you printed 1 million posters, so what? That doesn't really tell me very much. Now we're starting to get a little bit excited when we think about outcomes. Now, these outcomes are things like, this is about a quarter of the campaigns report them, and it's things like changes in knowledge, changes in attitudes, changes in behavior. Start to get a little bit more exciting, right? Now, not very excited still, because you know that some of these indicators, like knowledge, for example, often don't tell you that very much about behavior change, which is really what we're after. And finally, around here, tiny bar, about 10% of the campaigns, we have impacts. And these are biological impacts. So let's not forget, and this is harder than it seems, if you're doing a campaign on shark finning, the fact that your consumers stop consuming the product, it's not the end goal of your campaign. Your end goal is for shark mortality to decrease and populations to grow, or at least to stabilize. Right, so sometimes we think about behavior change work where behavior is the ultimate goal, but actually that's not the case, I would say, almost never for conservation science campaigns, because our goal is always biodiversity oriented. So moving along, so we have a sense now about the quantity of the information that we have for different aspects of these outcomes, these results, these impacts. But what about the quality of the information? Now, if you tell me, if you're a teacher and you say, oh, you came to my class, you give a lecture, and all the students really like rhinos now. That's an interesting piece of information, but it's anecdotal. It doesn't get me very, very far. This is where I want to bring back all of the talk about the scientific method. If I was talking about counting tigers, I don't think anyone would use bits of information by someone who walked into a park and say, oh, I saw about 10, so I think it's 20 to 25 tigers in this reserve. I don't think anyone would buy that. But very often we buy that type of information when it comes to outreach. We say, oh, the father of that child said that he really liked this a little bit when we look at the quality of the evidence. So here I'm just talking about outcomes and impacts, and here are just experimental designs. And by that what I mean is the way the information is collected. Not all information is equal when we're thinking about the value of it in terms of evidence. So if you think about outcomes, a lot of it is anecdotal. So just narratives from people, not collected in a structured way, just information that is obtained unsolicited, mostly. Now, the second biggest chunk of the information when it comes to outcomes is collected in a pre and post fashion. And this is simply when you collect information before the intervention and after, right? So it's a pretty popular way of collecting information. If you're running, say, a campaign on in a community or a set of locations, you collect information before the campaign, after the campaign. Now, the problem with this is that without a comparison unit, without a control group, you're assuming that any differences between the beginning and the end are because of your specific intervention, your specific campaign. Now, if you think about it, a lot of these campaigns last for several months, several years, some of them. People are exposed to thousands and thousands of messages every day. To get to the end of, say, a 2-year period and say, the changes that I'm measuring are because of my message, my single message that I put out, is pretty challenging. Before I move on, actually, let me give you a little bit of information on the impacts. Now, the impacts is interesting because, of course, now if you think about the number of campaigns, it's only about 20 campaigns that have information on impacts. So information, biological information, right? And here we don't have a lot of anecdotal evidence, but we have a lot of pre-post, and we have a lot of time series, so repeated measurement over time, which is nice. If you think about it, that's exactly what you would need to think about changes in biodiversity over time. Repeated measurement, because some of these things take a long time to recover. A lot of these species are very long-lived, have slow reproduction rates. But the problem we've found is that many of these campaigns, despite lasting 2 or 3 years, their measurement is still too short to actually account for any of the biological recovery. So if you think about fisheries, if you think about following on with the marine theme in the morning, a lot of these fisheries will take more than a decade to recover. If your measurement's only 3 or 4 years, that's not enough to tell you very much. So what have we learned from looking at all of this information for all these campaigns, all of this outreach? There's some positive things, no doubt. We have more effort. That's a start. We have higher quality effort. So this is something that I didn't reproduce graphically, but it was quite clear going through all the details of the different campaigns that the more recent ones have a lot more thought, are a lot more strategic, have a lot more theoretical underpinning. You're seeing a lot more, or we're seeing a lot more social science being integrated into these campaigns. That's a good thing. That's all those are important improvements. It's also true that there's a big recognition from practitioners and researchers that we need to be more active in understanding what works and what doesn't. That's a start. That's a positive thing. And I guess as I mentioned, I'm seeing more and more mixture of qualitative and quantitative methods. And that's really a really helpful thing when we're trying to, again, pinpoint the effect of one specific message, of one specific effort amongst the thousands and thousands of other things that people interact with in their everyday lives. Now, there are also a couple of less positive things. Now, one thing that we saw was the tendency to focus on indicators that allow you to report very large numbers. So anything that allows you to put a lot of zeros in your report, that's what gets reported. And that, I think, has a lot to do with, for example, a lot of these campaigns going online. If you're doing a campaign in social media, Facebook, Twitter, very easily, or relatively easily, you'll be able to report a reach of hundreds of thousands of people. We've reached hundreds of thousands. We had this many thousand likes, this many retweets, right? Even if, when you boil it down, what does it actually mean? Someone liked your post. How likely is it that that one particular like will translate into something that's actually meaningful, some behavior change? Not very much, I would argue. And, of course, I think I alluded to this. The fact that our evidence is not very robust makes it pretty difficult to challenge or to differentiate what is causal and what's correlated, right? So correlation is just two things that happen in a temporarily sort of related fashion, and causation being two things that happen in a sort of cause-effect relationship. Sometimes it's pretty tricky to differentiate the two. Something else that I saw, and I'm sure this will result in healthy debate afterwards. A lot of focus on students, younger groups of people, target audiences. Now, of course, children are the future, but very often, or I would almost argue, almost never are they the consumers of the products that we care about. And so the argument I'm making is that very often there is a very big focus on these types of groups because they're easy to access. Like they're in a school, they're a captive audience, they can't run away. They're in a structured fashion, right? They're in classrooms with teachers, they have power to allow you to do a survey or to do this presentation. Sometimes they're even happy that you're there. They can, not do that one particular lecture. They have someone to do it for them. So, well, I would argue that that is one of the reasons why there's so much focus on some of these audiences. I already alluded to this, and I really want to reinforce this aspect because I think it's really, really important. It really felt at times like a treasure hunt to put this data set together. It really shouldn't be that difficult to access basic information like the year when a campaign was done, not to mention other more detailed information around what was actually done, who did it, for how long, was there any measurement of outputs or outcomes, or anything like that. It was truly difficult, and even when you contact directly organizations, we didn't even get a lot of love. It was a little bit of suspicion. Why do you want to know this? Very protective of the information, and this is what I'll get back to this in just a minute. There certainly was plant blindness, and blindness of pretty much anything else that's not a mammal. And so, I'm sensitive to the fact that, yeah, virus and microbes are very important, but even for things that are big, like plants, we don't seem to care very much about them. And so that's where I think we need to broaden our spectrum of interest a little bit more, and also recognize that as scientists, we need to be pretty clear about what it is, the species that we use to engage the public and the species that we target in our research. They don't need to be the same, and we really need to be a little bit more open to working with different taxa. And lastly, going full circle to this to the scientific method back again, very often we have very poor reporting. So this is from a report a few years back, Rhino Horn campaign in Vietnam. It was a big hoo-ha, big press release. This was the crucial figure was this one of the press release. And if you notice this, there's a couple of things that might surprise you. The first one is that this is actually, the actual reduction was from, this one was 4.2 to 2.6%, so not very big in absolute terms, right? Yet, there's no measure of error here. No standard error, standard deviation, anything. How do we know how meaningful this difference really is? There's no statistics we use to look at what, is this a real difference? Would we expect this to be due to just sampling error or some other bias? No one looked at that. Just posted this 2% difference, sent out a press release, and that's what gets reported. Now, you might think that this is the name of the game, and this is how things are, and this is something we have to accept. But I would argue that how can we keep ourselves credible? How can we then have a voice in some of the real struggles that we have when we don't report information, even with the basic rules of almost argue undergraduate science? Now, all of this is interesting to some degree, but I think the key thing for me is this bigger picture. What does it mean for us more broadly in conservation? What does it say about us? What do we have to do? Well, I think the first thing is we have to start thinking beyond natural sciences. And I very much appreciate the fact that in this morning, a lot of the talks had clearly a mixed social and natural science emphasis. And that's really important. You don't see that everywhere, and so we need to continue to push in that direction. So it's important to realize that a lot of the outreach work does not have that social science component, and so it is a little bit akin to a black hole. We don't really know what it is. We don't know how things are before or after it go. There's a sort of separate reality that we have very little information about. Now, it is important to realize that social science is also science. It was based on exactly the same scientific method that I had up here just a few minutes back. And so that social science and that robust social science is really you're gonna need that underpinning to have evaluation, to know what works and what doesn't, and to get to learn it. Not science for science's sake, science for learning. Now, here, the F word, of course, you've guessed it, is failure. Very often, I have discussions about why don't we know more about what works and what doesn't in conservation outreach, in influencing people's behavior. Very often people say, oh, it's a technical issue. It's a technical matter. We don't have, impact evaluation has evolved in the last decade. It's now a field of its own, practically. You have impact evaluation journals, impact evaluation conferences, impact evaluation societies. It's almost its own little thing, which is great. But if you think about the range of expertises that we have brought into conservation, I don't think that's really the issue. I don't think the issue is a technical issue. I don't think we are going to solve this by giving more workshops to people, creating more diplomas, and all of that. I think the reason that we have not historically been very good at measuring or evaluating our work is because we have this perception that to be a good conservationist is to never fail. You have to have a perfect record. You have to have a Midas touch. Everything you touch is gold. Right? Never failing. You have to rise quickly, never failing. That's the objective. Well, actually, I would argue that anything that has to do with social change, and think about this, consumer demand and managing that might be increasing or decreasing or whichever way you want, it is a social change. It is changing a practice. It is changing a habit that's been in place in many cases for a long time, right? So that's social change. When it comes to any type of social change, I would argue that there's high complexity, it's difficult, and there's high uncertainty. We can't control the system, right? This is a living system. Things happen all the time. Politics, the media, natural disasters, priorities shift all the time. There's a high degree of uncertainty over what's going to happen. Now, if that's the case, then we know that there will always be a measure of risk in what we do. And by a risk, I just mean that things might not work, that things don't really, the world's not really the way we predict it is. Now, if that's the case, we know that we will fail sometimes. In fact, I would argue even that we will fail in situations such as this, high complexity, high uncertainty. You would expect us to fail most of the time. And that's fine, as long as we learn and do better next time. That's what we'd expect. Now, the interesting thing about all of this, risk and failure have been topics that make a lot of people uncomfortable. But at the same time, I look at a lot of mission statements from conservation NGOs, from university departments, and you know what I see? I see a lot of people talking about innovation. Now, the interesting thing about innovation is that for me, it's just the flip side of the same coin. So if risk is a coin, one side is failure, the other side is innovation. You can't innovate without doing things differently. If you do things differently, you take risks, and that means you'll fail sometime. And that's normal. That's expected. In fact, I would argue that what should be questioned is when someone or an organization presents a stellar record with 0 failures and 100% success. Because that, of course, means, let's go back to the high complexity, high uncertainty, lack of transparency. Right? It's highly unlikely that in a situation like that, anyone or any organization can succeed all the time. Now, this sort of flip side between risk and innovation, we see it one way in conservation, but in other sectors, things are really different. Now, a lot of us think of Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg as visionaries, but they fail all the time. 90% of the startups fail within the first 5 years. If we want to really emulate this type of culture that they have, of being different, of being innovative, of trying out different ideas, then we need to embrace the idea of failure as well. We need to know that it's okay to fail, as long as we learn from it and do better next time. Now, and this is maybe the key point that I'm trying, now if you take nothing else away from this presentation, take this away. And that is that, as conservationists, And more as conservationists that work around human dimensions of conservation, that work with people, that influence livelihoods, that influence consumption patterns. We have an ethical issue to understand what results from our actions, from our interventions, from our campaigns. In a high complexity, high uncertainty environment, the worst case scenario is not that nothing happens. The worst case scenario is that the opposite of what we want happens. And if that's the case, then we need to know. Because if it's all about scaling, doing things in more locations, doing things in more countries, doing things across landscapes, what if we're scaling up an intervention that has the opposite effect? Now, this is not as crazy as it seems. And particularly if we don't evaluate, if we don't know what works and what doesn't, there's no way for us to know. Now, I'm proposing three paths towards normalizing failure, normalizing learning. Let's call it learning. One is communication. We need to talk about it. We need to be comfortably saying, actually, I had this idea, it didn't go very well, this is what I learned, I hope you can do better next time and you can all learn from my experience. Now, this is not some crazy idea that I came up with. International development as a field has the Fail Festival. People that work in international development go out and they talk about what didn't work, what they learned, and how they're going to do better next time. You have things like the Failure Report. Engineers Without Borders every year publishes a report that it's not like a brochure you see every day when it talks about all the successes they've had. It actually talks about all the things they did wrong in the previous year. Incentives. Now, of course, conservationists have some responsibility, but there's also some responsibility on the donor side. Donors set the rules and the guidelines for how money is spent. And so they have the ability to say, unless you learn something from this, then I'm not interested. Now, again, this is not some crazy thing I made up. If you look at philanthropists like the Arnold Foundation, they don't fund for a particular outcome. They fund projects for evidence on whether something works or not. So yeah, maybe you didn't achieve your outcome. Maybe you didn't manage to reduce the rate of incidence of malaria in this community. But if you learn something, and you can share that, and when the next person overcomes and they can do a better job, that's still valuable. Leadership. Now, believe it or not, I'm still considered early career in some places. And this is where I put the challenge out for more senior people. They are the ones who make decisions on departmental priorities, that sit on boards of organizations. And it's really key that they take on this mission of understanding impact, understanding what works and what doesn't, and really putting the priorities of the organization forward. Now, again, this has been done. Look at aviation. In the bars, you have numbers of casualties. In trend line, numbers of passengers. It's pretty clear from this graph that flying has never been safer, and it's getting safer by the year. Now, this is not some sort of magical. There's no wizardry involved in this. It was simply the fact that airlines realized that every time anyone has an accident, it doesn't hurt just their bottom line; it hurts everyone's bottom line. So when you have a plane crash, what happens is an independent, open investigation when the conclusions are shared amongst all airlines, not just the one that had the accident. The airline's not hogging all the information, trying to look bad. They're open and saying, yes, we made a mistake. And we're trying to make sure that no one else makes the same mistake. And that's the result. I think it's pretty remarkable improvement in safety. Now, I want to finish with a story. This is Abraham Wald. He is an Eastern European mathematician. His country was under attack during the Second World War, and he fled to the United States. He ended up working for the Air Force during the Second World War. Now, at one point, the Air Force came to him and said, well, Abraham, we have a challenge. And that challenge is that our airplanes are going out, facing the enemy, and we're losing a lot of airplanes, a lot of aircraft. And this is problematic. Now, we've thought about reinforcing these airplanes, but we can't reinforce the entire surface of a plane because then it becomes too heavy. So we need to know what bits of the airplane should we reinforce. Okay? Oh, and by the way, they also said, Tim, we have this information here. And this is in black. In black here is the data they had of where the damage was done to airplanes that returned. So that every time a plane returned, they would map where the damage had been done and then collate all the data, one over the other, of all these different airplanes to make up this map. And so they said to him, so well, what we're thinking is, we know where the airplanes are taking damage, so we're going to reinforce those parts. Seems pretty logical. But actually what Wald said was, he said, I think that's the wrong approach. I think you should do exactly the opposite. Because don't forget, they were only looking at the airplanes that returned. So this map is actually a map of where a plane can take damage and still make it back. The planes that take damage on these other areas, because they are critical areas, don't come back at all. Now, with a little bit of data, a little bit of intuition, and considering the full data set, not just the successes, Abraham Wald was able to save thousands of lives. And I'm confident that with a little bit of critical thinking, a little bit of data, altogether, we can save millions of species. Thank you very much.